It's a consensus estimate of a repo rate hike at the outcome of the Monetary Policy Committee meet tomorrow. That's going to be the big story all day tomorrow, and all eyes are on that. The RBI is also expected to withdraw its accommodative stance as curbing inflation will top the agenda in line with challenges facing other central bankers. We just had the Bank of England earlier this evening, India time, hike rates by 50 basis points. It's the biggest hike in 27 years. The Bank of England also said that Britain will be looking at a recession as early as the fourth quarter of 2022. And so central banks across the globe are in firefighting mode to tame inflation. But what can we expect tomorrow? Let me first bring in my colleague Ankur Mishra, who's breaking down the ET Now poll in which almost 100% of the economists surveyed expect a repo rate hike.
Yes, final countdown for RBI credit policy has begun, and all eyes are there on RBI governor, who will be announcing at 10 a.m. what is going to be the stance of RBI. Now, we have tried to make some informed guess by speaking to a few experts and did a poll. The first important question we asked was whether or not this time will be repo rate hike. 100% respondents have said that there is going to be repo rate hike, but of course the quantum, it lies between 30 basis point to 50 basis point. That is the expectation. The second important question is about the stance of the RBI, whether or not it will be changed or not, because RBI has been maintaining that they have started withdrawal of accommodation, but will it move to neutral or not? That is something which needs to be watched out. Economists also expect that 50 basis point is the highest quantum which can be raised by Reserve Bank of India this time, after 90 bips which were already raised this financial year. Apart from that, RBI will hike. Will it hike in tandem with the US Fed or not? That is something which also needs to be watched out.
All right, Mythili Bhusnurmath, consulting editor, ET Now, joining me for more. Mythili, so the rate hike is pretty much factored in. How much is the question, but what are you going to be looking for? Is it the commentary and to see whether the RBI will move away from its accommodative stance?
Well, yes, in fact, Tamanna, the commentary will be the more interesting part of the policy tomorrow, because as you said, everybody knows that there will be a rate hike. The question is really of quantum. So whether, if they have to do a 50 basis point hike, then yes, that would warrant comment. But anything between 35 to say 40 would not really warrant very much comment, because that is more or less expected. So what would be more interesting would be to see what does the RBI say about the future. It doesn't give any guidance at all. It had stopped giving guidance. Will it change its stance, as you said? Because unlike other advanced countries' central banks, the big signals in India are not so clear. Both in the US as well as the UK, it is very clear that inflation is trending up and is likely to increase. Growth is clearly trending down. In India, inflation is softening, but the signal is not very clear. From a peak of 7.8 in April, we're just about little over 7%. Nothing very significant, just 2 months. Similarly, on the growth front, we have high frequency indicators, but we've seen the latest slowdown in exports. So both on the inflation front and in the growth front, the signals are not very clear in the Indian context. Added to that, we have the factor that the rupee has been weakening, trade deficit has been widening, commodity prices are still high. So I'm afraid in the Indian context, the decision before the central bank will not be as clear-cut, which is precisely why they might want to kind of hedge a little bit and say go in for something like a 40 basis point hike, because for the moment we really do not know. There are no clear signals. Growth seems to be on track, but exports could play spoil sport. A worsening trade deficit could impact current account deficit and spoil things again. Inflation, it's much too early to say whether inflation has peaked. Both the governor as well as the finance minister seem to suggest, and even the CEA, Anant Nageshwaran, has suggested that inflation has peaked. But we really cannot say, because as we go forward, the base effect wears out. So you could see inflation pick up once again. So I think all eyes will have to be on the commentary, which is likely to be far more nuanced than just a simple message sent in the rate hike, the quantum of the rate hike.
You know, Mythili, so much has also happened since the last policy. In terms of geopolitical activity, we now have this Taiwan situation coming in, but we need to see how that will, of course, pan out. What will be the priority for the Reserve Bank? Is it continuing to be, or will it now switch to being controlling inflation? Because right now, the word coming from the RBI has been, okay, we're a bit worried about inflation, but we're more worried about growth.
No, on the contrary, Tamanna, I think they have made that shift. They made it quite clear that inflation is their first priority. That had been quite clearly indicated. But I think the worry now is that when you fight inflation, and the only armor really available with central banks is to hike interest rates. Now, RBI, unfortunately or fortunately for the government, is the merchant banker for the government. So it's also its responsibility to ensure that government is able to borrow at the cheapest possible rate. So how on earth do you balance these two things? Inflation demands that you hike interest rates, government demands that you lower interest rates. So it clearly has a very tough call. It always has these contradictions in its objectives, but when inflation is high, these contradictions become much more stark. So for the moment, though they had said inflation is their first priority, clearly government is getting angsty about interest rates rising, bond yields have risen, though we do not know whether that has peaked, whether that will fall or rise a little further. So clearly RBI will perhaps, which is why they are unlikely to go for say a 25, nor are they likely to go for a 50. They'll go somewhere in between. The middle path is what Indians have always favored. So 40 is my best guess.
I just want you to stay on, Mythili, because there was the other big story this evening which came in from from England's central bank, where the Bank of England has voted to raise rates by 50 basis points. The central bank has opted for its biggest rate hike in 27 years. Raising the alarm, the bank has predicted that the UK economy will slide into a recession from the fourth quarter of the year. The central bank expects the recession to be a long one, lasting 5 quarters. The bank has also cut GDP forecasts for 2022, 23 and 24. Let's listen in to the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey on what's pushing UK into a recession.
The rise in energy prices has exacerbated the fall in real incomes and so led to another significant deterioration in the outlook for activity in the UK and in the rest of Europe. GDP growth in the UK has slowed and the economy is now forecast to enter recession later this year.
All right, Mythili, so, sort of an alarming message coming in from the Bank of England. I just want you to tell us what you think about the recession statement, because the US would have technically been in a recession. Then they sort of tweaked the definition. They're saying, no, we're not really in a recession. The UK saying that we probably are going to go into one. Is this something which you think will spread?
Well, see, the UK situation is a little different from that of the US, because even though in the US, technically the GDP has contracted for 2 consecutive quarters, the fact is that employment is doing very well. Unemployment rates are very low. There are many vacancies for every job applicant. So the US position is slightly different, which is why the US is entirely right, the government is entirely right to say that we're not in a recession, because the definition of recession is much wider than the simple 2 quarters, consecutive quarters decline. The UK position is different because apart from the contraction in GDP growth, the fact is that unemployment levels are also very high in the UK. So the UK is clearly going to go into a recession in a much more definitive way than the US. Remember, the Bank of England is also on record to say that by October, inflation will hit 13%. Now that is an astronomical number for an advanced economy. So clearly, both in the US and in the UK, the signals are very clear. Inflation is rising, growth is slowing. It hasn't definitely as not compared to India. In India, the complication is that, as I said, the signals both on the inflation front and on the GDP front are not very clear. They're much more ambiguous, which is why it'll be interesting to see how the MPC and the governor, the RBI, because ultimately it is the RBI that calls the shots. We might have the MPC, but ultimately the governor has a casting vote. It is a 6-member MPC, 3 from within the RBI, 3 from outside. So clearly the RBI has the final say. So it'll be interesting to see how the RBI tries to square the hole, as it were, because it really has 2 very contradictory and very ambiguous signals before it. So which is why the commentary is going to be much more important than the rate action per se.
Thank you so much, Mythili. Always a pleasure to speak with you. And of course, we'll track your commentary tomorrow after the policy is announced.